So hello, my name is Megan. I am the Public Engagement Assistant at Heritage Quay, which is the archive service of the University of Huddersfield. If you've not been, please do. It is not only the point of access to the archive collections of the university, there's also an exhibition space which is open 6 days a week. We have a rolling programme of exhibitions. It's just over the road. Today, however, we've brought some things up to town, which is extremely exciting for us. We're here today to talk about one small archive in that collection, a set of Indian textile fabrics that first came to Huddersfield in 1866. They were characterised as a trade museum. They were designed so that manufacturers could learn from and assess the economic and practical viability of producing similar textiles, both for a domestic market and for export to India. And while Avalon and Uthra will talk more about the imperial history and the design history elements of those volumes, I wanted to give a bit of a flavour of the Huddersfield that these volumes came to, and in particular the institution, the Mechanics Institute, to which they were donated. And it's worth saying that the Mechanics Institute is one of the predecessor organisations of the university. So that's why these volumes are in the university's collection today. So Huddersfield of the 1860s is a thriving market town. Its population, give or take 60,000, with textiles, engineering and chemical industries being the kind of principal activities in the town. The textile industry is wool, both woolen and worsted. And the thing that Huddersfield was best known for in this period was fancy work, which broadly refers to worsted with very intricate weaves and colour effects. Fancy work is super fashionable, but relies on constant innovation and novelty in design to kind of keep it fashionable. And it's in this context that the Huddersfield Mechanics Institute is founded. So a town with a hugely expanding population, centre of wool industries. The Mechanics starts life actually with a different name in 1841 as the Young Men's Mental Improvement Society. In its first year, it has maybe 30 people attending classes, but by 1843, it's been renamed the Huddersfield Mechanics Institute. It's a really interesting place, not least because of its widely noted and actually quite unusual success. So a lot of what they do at the Mechanics is elementary education for boys and young men. So from the 1840s to the 1870s, that's a large amount of the work that goes on there. So reading, writing, arithmetic, grammar, geography. But they also do chemistry and ornamental design. It's the first organisation in the country that teaches weaving as a class. And because of Huddersfield being this kind of centre of fancy work, the Mechanics Institute stressed how important teaching design was in the town. The ornamental drawing classes that they ran, principally attended by fancy worsted weavers, by carpet weavers, by woolen printers. And the membership of the institution is chiefly operatives. They have quite a clever way of allowing people with very low incomes to become kind of temporary members to attend classes, but not have to sustain a membership throughout the year. The institution itself is principally financed by middle-class annual subscribers and a lot of factory owners. So when the first sort of purpose-built building of the Mechanics, which is still here on Northumberland Street, which is it's a bit in orange on the map, when that is built, some of the major donors are owners of textile companies whose operatives attend classes at the Mechanics. So all of these things are kind of really intricately linked. In this period, mechanics institutions across the country are quite widely regarded as failures, right? They are seen as not supplying the education to people that had been intended. And Huddersfield stands out from this. So unusually, it is seen as very successful. It's described as the only mechanics institute which had any pretensions to meet the needs of the people, and also as the best in England. When the Society of Arts introduces prize examinations in 1857, Huddersfield is the only place outside of London. The Mechanics Institute in Huddersfield is the only place outside of London which is invited to take part in these kind of trial examinations. This is one of the examples of its success. In 1868, they institute a chemistry of dyeing class. It's so popular that it gets kind of twice the number of students they were expecting, one even coming from Skipton to attend. So really kind of leading technical education. And it's to this institution that in 1866, these volumes of textile samples, so this is 700 samples of textile fabrics, come. They're one of 20 sets, which are made up at the India Museum by John Forbes Watson, and 13 of these are distributed in the UK. And again, this is something that Avalon and Uthra will talk about in much more detail later. Interestingly, Huddersfield is the only place where these volumes get given to a mechanics institute. So elsewhere in the country, they are given to chambers of commerce. So that's so in Belfast, Bradford, Glasgow, Halifax, Liverpool, Manchester. They get given to a couple of industrial museums. And in a couple of cases, Macclesfield and Preston, they get given to the town corporation. But Huddersfield is the only place where they go to a mechanics institute. And there are a couple of factors here. One certainly is the national reputation of the Huddersfield Mechanics Institute. And the other is the able advocacy of Edward Leatham, who was the Liberal, well, he wasn't in 1866, but he was the Liberal MP both before and after this period. And he did a lot of work negotiating for the volumes to come to the Mechanics Institute in Huddersfield. And it's a really big deal when they come. This is part of a report from the Huddersfield Chronicle, the local newspaper of the day, which says, the Secretary of State for India, in accordance with a promise made some 12 months ago, has conferred an honour of high degree upon the town, and talks about the esteem that this shows that people have for both the Mechanics Institute, for the town, and for the region. And what do? So they get these volumes. It's a really big deal. And so they put rules in place for, okay, how do you access this collection? The collection comes in cabinets. Each volume has its own little glass cabinet. And certain rules get attached to how people are supposed to access these volumes by the India Museum. So you have to have a letter signed by one of quite a small handful of people. You have to record your name in a special book. The volumes must never leave the secretary's office. Any damage to the books will be prosecuted. Access has to be supervised, and so on. They're actually open for public view twice a week. So on Tuesdays and Fridays from 2 till 5, the cabinets are opened and people can go and inspect them. But access is very closely controlled. After this, though, it becomes very hard to trace the life of these volumes. We have them coming in, we have them being joyously received. We have the little cardboard advertisements, 50 of which are distributed around local towns saying, look what you can come and see if you can get the right paperwork at the Huddersfield Mechanics Institute. And then we don't really know anything more. We do know that textile samples generally have always been and continue to be an important part of teaching at the mechanics, and then what became the technical college, and then the poly, and now the university. We use the samples that we look after in our archives. We know that they get used in teaching today. These are just some examples of other textile samples in the collection. And we know that these samples were used as well because of what they look like. So they've got ink splatters, some of them have got thumbprints. They're much less smoky than they were a couple of months ago because some of our wonderful volunteers who are sitting here in the room have been doing amazing work with smoke sponges. But they bear the marks of use. We can see that they were part of the technical school library, though frustratingly we can't track them down in any library catalogues. And the facsimile kind of introduction to the collection, which talks about different weaving techniques, different spinning techniques, and so on, was a borrowable book in the Polytechnic. You can see the library label on the inside of the book here. I think the other thing that we have to say about this collection, and here we go, is that it's extremely partial. So there is an awful lot of this collection missing. And as a historian, that's really interesting because that shows how much it's been used. There are many of the volumes that have fallen apart. So we've got lots of the sheets are just kind of loose leaves rather than still bound. And you can see here in the center, just the pages that have been taken out. And there's a really interesting question here, which is kind of about the survival bias of what's still here and what isn't. So generally, use is destructive. And although it's not universally true, it's often the case with working collections that the things which survive have been less used than the things that don't. We'll talk in a bit about the quality of some of the muslins in these volumes. The muslins volume there's still those in it. It's amazing. But it's also simply impossible to produce that quality on machines and to produce that quality outside of the specific area of India where it's produced. So does that mean that people just didn't really look at those? Is that why we have those and we don't really have any of the woolen fabric samples that were part of the collection? I don't necessarily have, well, I don't have answers to that, but it's an interesting thing to think around in terms of use and survival. Is what's still here because it was actually less important than what's no longer part of this collection? On that note, of a very partial collection, which was originally given to one of the most well-regarded centres of technical education in the country, I'm going to hand over to Avalon and Uthra, who will look at design and production in India, at the impact of the British export industry on Indian textile production, and the stories of these sample books beyond Huddersfield.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that. That was really fascinating. Wonderful to have a history of how they're actually used, because what I'm going to be telling you about is how they were made. So at the beginning of the story of these particular albums. My name is Avalon Fotheringham, and I am the curator for the South Asian Textiles and Dress collection at the V&A. And the reason why the V&A comes into this is because about half of the 10,000 textiles that the V&A holds from across South Asia, from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, came to us via a major transfer in 1879 from an institution called the India Museum. So roughly 5,000 textiles came from this one place, the India Museum. And of those 5,000 textiles, thousands looked a little bit like what you're seeing in the picture here. bits and pieces, small fragments wrapped up in paper with annotations on them. This is the remains. This is what was left behind through the creation of the albums that we're looking at today. And it's a fascinating project for what it tells us about the history of museology, the idea of sharing collections before the internet existed, for instance, before photographs were widely available, how you make collections accessible to the people who need them and are going to make the most use of them, but also what is the cost of that use? And the tensions between those two things is a little bit of what I'm going to explore with you now. So when we're telling the story of the albums, we have to start at the beginning, and the beginning is the India Museum itself. This institution opened in 1801, and it was created by the East India Company, which at that time, obviously, was in charge of large parts of India through very concerted efforts, very concerted efforts to gain militaristic control, financial control, and to gain all the benefits of the products of India. This museum initially was set up as a place that people who had served in India for the company could deposit the things that they brought back with them. Initially, these were libraries, manuscripts, paintings. And the idea was that people could come and consult this library to learn more about India before they went there themselves. So old servants would come back and drop off things that they thought were useful, and new servants would go to the library and learn from those things before actually traveling to India for their turn in the subcontinent. But very swiftly, it moved past being just a library and became something much more. It became a repository. They called it their Oriental Repository. And anything that anybody found remotely interesting in India was brought back to this place. That included all sorts of really crazy things. At some point, somebody brought back a hairball from the stomach of a goat that had died on the ship on the way to India. But they also brought back some really important treasures, especially things like, most famously, Tipu's tiger, which was looted from Tipu Sultan's palace when the East India Company forces took over and sacked that city. So it became a museum that was swiftly building to hold what was becoming a very important collection of Indian material culture. And as that collection grew, the role of the museum changed. It stopped being something that was just there for East India Company servants to sort of spend a nice afternoon in, and it started becoming a dedicated institution for teaching people about India as a colony of the empire. So over the first half of the 19th century, people were going there to learn Indian languages. They were going there to learn Indian customs and laws. They were going to find out how things would be when they arrived in India. And when they came back, they brought all their research with them and all their samples with them and everything that they had done while there, and added that to the library as well in the museum. So it grew and became a more important resource, essentially and very literally an imperial resource for learning about this new and burgeoning colony of the empire. The real watershed moment for the institution was an event called the Great Exhibition of 1851, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. This happened in London in 1851, and it brought together all the nations all around the world, essentially, who put together displays showcasing the best of what their countries had to offer. Now, India by this point was in a majority under the control of the East India Company, and it was not given the privilege of curating its own displays. The East India Company curated its displays. It did this via a complex system of committees, cascading committees that went from London through to the major presidencies, through to local committees and individual cities. And each of these committees were given lists of the kinds of things that were wanted from their specific area that would be put on display. Now, the curator of this display, who was working for the East India Company, very confusingly named as John Forbes Royal, but is not the person we're going to be most focused on today, even though his name is very similar. He was most interested in the agricultural products of India. He felt that this was going to be the most valuable contribution India could make to the empire. It could grow food, it could be mined for minerals. It was the raw products, as they were referred to at that time, that he was really interested in putting on display. But what ended up actually stealing the show were all the textiles. The textiles that were put on display in 1851 by the East India Company to represent India blew everyone away. They actually changed British design in a really significant way, because it was these textiles that were used to create books like The Grammar of Ornament, which would become foundational texts in the reform of British design, especially in the context of rapid industrialization. So it was these handmade textiles that really caught everybody's eye. And for the first time, people here were beginning to appreciate actually how important Indian textile design was and how influential it could be more sort of across broadly publicly. This was becoming something that was being more appreciated. At the end of the exhibition, because the East India Company had curated the show, they obviously had first rights to take whatever they wanted from the show and put it into their own museum. They paid for it after all, so they had their first pick. And they did pick a few things here and there, and that sort of grew the collection a little bit more. But what happened next was much more important, because in 1855, the French, having seen what a big success 1851 was in London, decided to hold their own exhibition. And that was the Paris exhibition of 1855. And this one, based on the success of the textiles at 1851, made a much more concerted effort to represent the whole variety of textiles from South Asia that were being produced at that time. Thousands of textiles came to this show. And again, because of the success of 1851, the India Museum itself also had a bit of a rethink about what its priorities should be. And it started moving away from the raw products, the agricultural products, the seeds and the rice samples. And it started thinking about creating an industrial wing for the exhibition, for the museum, pardon me. This was approved by the East India Company. They put up the permission, and the curator, John Forbes Royal again, was allowed to select a vast quantity of textiles from this exhibition to go into the museum to create a new industrial wing of textile design within the India Museum itself. So in 1858, the East India Company is dissolved, and the government of India comes under the umbrella of the British government. It officially becomes an imperial colony. With that transfer of power, the India Museum is also transferred into the holdings of the British government and the control of the British government. But they didn't give up their role when it comes to the creation of exhibitions and the building of their collections. So essentially what ends up happening is this really neat pipeline where the India Museum is the government's primary authority for information about India. It is also responsible for curating Indian displays at exhibitions all around the world, including leading exhibitions in India itself. It lends its own collections to other people's exhibitions. And every time there is an exhibition somewhere else, it takes material from those exhibitions and puts it in its own collections. So over the next 2 decades, the collections continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. And they come in regularly every few years whenever there's an exhibition. And this is really useful because what it gives us is a snapshot every few years of what's happening to Indian textile production. So it's a very, very valuable collection in that way. But it's serving very much as the government's source of information on India. And it is not only bringing in information, it is sending out that information to teach others. And this is where John Forbes Watson comes in. John Forbes Watson was the first person, and indeed I think the only person, to hold the job title of reporter on the products of India. And this was a government position that was created essentially to do just that, to know in depth everything that India had to offer the empire, and to be able to offer that information to anybody who could use it to the benefit of empire. That role was a dual role. Holding that post, you also were by default the director of the India Museum, which makes perfect sense because the India Museum is your reservoir for all of the data about that information, right? So he is doing both those things at once. And he is in many ways the perfect person for this job. He was meant for this job. He was designed for this job because he was an obsessive classifier. He's a Victorian man, so to some extent that was going to be a given, but he takes it to another level. He is classifying anything and everything. What we're seeing here, for instance, Portable Trade Museum, these are all seeds. He's got a set of seeds that you can flick through so you can see all the different kinds of seeds that grow different kinds of crops in India. He went even beyond raw products and seeds. He went right to people. He produced a book called The People of India, where he tried to classify all of the different peoples of India, including representative template pictures of individuals who were so-called representative of their group. So he's all about locking down categories and being able to pass that information on in such a way that it could be useful to the empire. He was not the first person to take this same approach to textiles. There are actually some great pre-existing templates that he likely did draw on before he turned his attention to the project of the textile manufacturers of India. These are a couple of them. Two of the ones on the left-hand side came through the exhibition of 1855 and were assembled by the local committee at Lahore. They cut up samples of fabric and pasted them into pages, and they said things like, this one is particularly popular with the Sikhs, this one is particularly popular with the Hindus. So they already were applying a system by which different kinds of fabrics were being attached to different kinds of peoples, with the idea of being able to explain not only how you could recognize different kinds of peoples, but what those peoples would buy, which is really important for a major textile producing country like Britain at this time. In addition to these pieces, there's also another set of books that had been just gifted to the India Museum. And these included what you're seeing here on the right, pages of textile swatches, again, a very similar format to what Watson ended up doing next. So we think that he absolutely had some models by which he was going by. He didn't sort of reinvent the wheel in the textile manufacturers of India. But what he did do is really blow it up. This is an incredibly ambitious project. It takes him several years. He has to seek the permission from the company, from the government first, in order to be able to use the collection in this way. And then it takes several years to actually make the albums, because the original album is made up of 700 samples of 700 different kinds of cloth across 18 different volumes. And he makes 20 sets of these volumes. And the idea of this is to be able to show a representative example of practically every major type of textile being produced in India in different qualities as well. So you can get both the rough and the fine in order to give you a complete expert knowledge of the kinds of things that are being made, how they're being made, how they're being used, who's using them. He's giving you as much data as he can possibly collect. And he is using mostly the textiles that came into the India Museum through the exhibition of 1855. What did that look like? It looks like this. So he's taking complete pieces of cloth and he's cutting out swatches. This one is sort of the cleanest, one of the cleanest we have. Most of them are not this clean. In fact, they're all bits and pieces, because he actually was really interested in making sure that this samples gave you the whole picture of the design. So it wouldn't be enough to give you a bit from the middle. You needed to have a bit from the middle and a bit from the corner and a bit from the other corner if that corner was different, plus a little bit that you could touch so that you understood what the texture of the fabric was like. So that the assembly of these were extremely thought out in great detail. But as you can see, left some victims behind in the sense of the collection itself. Now, this first set of volumes was incredibly popular. It was wanted as soon as it was created, essentially. All 20 sets did go out, the one to Huddersfield being one of them in the UK. One of them is still in London with us at the V&A, and then all across the UK and some in South Asia. And he explained that he sent them to South Asia specifically because he wanted agents in South Asia to be able to look at a page and then call a manufacturer in the UK and say, I want you to make the piece that is on this page. And that manufacturer would be able to look at the same page, which would have the same sample. And that way there would be no misunderstanding. You would get exactly what you'd ordered. It's kind of quite a brilliant idea in lieu of not being able to share pictures and how long it takes to ship things, right? It makes perfect sense. So he's thinking, wow, this is great. This has been a really popular project. Definitely there is demand for more. He gets a letter from Vienna asking for a set as well, but by this point, all of the sets are gone. So he assumes there's absolutely going to be a market for more of these. I can make some more. So he begins starting a second edition a few years later. And this is even bigger. So he's got another 700 textiles, different textiles from the first ones, plus 400 chromolithographs, which he has cut swatches, mounted them on boards, and had them lithographed as illustrations. This is a massive undertaking, and he's going to make 45 sets, so more than the 20 that he was originally going to do. Unfortunately for him, in fact, it seems that the popularity of the first edition was a bit of a flash in a pan. He doesn't get as much of a demand for the second editions as he does as the first, and only about, I think, 25 end up being made at all. The rest don't get made, which is why now at the V&A, we have all of those leftover fragments because they never actually went into the books. But the important thing is that he does actually, those things are prepped to go into those books, whether they were created or not, they were still cut to be used in that way. In 1879, the India Museum loses its government support and it loses its government funding, and it's closed. And as a result, its collections are split up. So all of its raw products, its agricultural products, its wood samples, its rice samples, its cotton samples, all of that goes to Kew. Anything that is vaguely archaeological or artistic goes to the British Museum. And all of the industrial design goes to the South Kensington Museum, which later becomes the V&A. And that includes the entirety of the textile collection and all the remainder of what he left behind in the process of making the album. So all of those fragments, all of his notes. And that's where it still is with us today. But looking back at the legacy of that project in the context of the collection, we have a bit of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, he absolutely, unfortunately, had phenomenal taste. He picked many of the very best pieces of the textile collection to put into these albums, which makes it's understandable in context. He was trying to show people the best of what India was making at that time. But sadly for us, he was not limiting himself to things that he had duplicates of or things that were already flat textiles that you wouldn't notice a bit cut out of. He was going even for full ensembles. So this is all that's what's left of what was once a very royal ensemble of several different pieces of brocaded silk. And we have that information based on the India Museum slip books, which were their version of acquisition records at that time. So it can be quite painful to go through the collection and find these bits and pieces and look them up and find these entries for what sounds like would have been a phenomenal piece of dress at one point. More broadly and much more significantly, in terms of what these books meant for South Asia as a whole, Forbes Watson was genuinely convinced that Britain supplying India with industrially made imitations of their own fabrics would be good for India, as well as being good for Britain. He explains that the idea is that if we can provide the Indian consumer with cheaper pieces, then they will have more money, and then they can afford to live better because they don't have to spend so much on clothing. And of course, we'll make a bunch of money because there's 200 million people living in India. And so that's a huge market for us. You know, this is a win-win situation. He did acknowledge, he actually says that there may be some hardship, you know, but it will be short-lived. Sure, a lot of weavers might lose their work, but the idea is that they'll swiftly move into other occupations. And in the meantime, the economies of both countries will be strong. He certainly could not in any way have envisioned that the impact of industrial textiles from Britain on India would be so significant, it would actually drive independence movements that would in fact finally win India its freedom. He did not at that time understand the hot point that textile manufacturing represented in the colonial structure at that time. We don't, as of yet, know to what extent the textile manufacturers of India actually drove the industrial production of imitation textiles. There are some indications based on certain copyright designs in the National Archives, for instance. It seems that some of these fabrics in the albums were directly copied from the albums and made by machine. But we don't know in what volume, we don't know what in scale. So we can't actually say for certain whether or not these had the kind of impact that he designed them to have, but certainly his intent was that they would be used in that way to create mass imitation products for the purposes of replacing handloom goods. But even more sort of subtly and just as negative was his presumption in these albums that the reason why this project could succeed was because India itself did not have fashion in the same way that Europe had fashion, that Indians more or less always have and always would dress basically the same way. And therefore, once you had a good sample you could work with, that was the only sample you would ever need. You could just keep recreating the same textile over and over and over again, and demand would never go away. And this is kind of quite an insidious assumption. It's a very colonial era assumption, but it's one that actually we have been living with, we are still living with today. And really, it's only in the past few decades that fashion historians here in Europe have begun to look seriously at the history of fashion in India, even acknowledging that fashion does exist in India. That's how insidious this concept has been. And Forbes Watson, in part, helped to perpetuate that assumption. So there are larger costs to South Asia that are, much more significant in proportion to the loss of the 1,400 textiles that he used in making these pieces. However, there are some unexpected benefits as well, mainly that we have Forbes Watson to thank for knowing what we do know about these textiles. In large part, he probably got the data that he got from labels that had been attached to the exhibition objects in 1855, but it's very hard to keep a paper label on a foldable textile alive for 150 years, and a lot of these labels are now gone. So because he documented it at the time, we actually are able to say, this is what this is. And I can show you these two pieces and show you what we're dealing with. So if we did not have his albums, all we would know about this piece of muslin is that it is a piece of muslin, and that it came from Calcutta in 1855. That would be the extent of the information we have based on the India Museum's own records, which were very, very sparse. Because of his details, we know how much it originally weighed, we know how long and wide it originally was, we know exactly where it came from, how much it cost, who was using it and in what way, which is the kind of stuff that nobody was putting into acquisition registers at that time. So we have him to thank for everything that we do know about the collection. Without his documentation, this collection would be far less useful than it is today. And ironically, and what Uthra will tell you more about, despite the fact that his intention was that these samples should be used to create industrial imitations, what has happened is actually the inverse. Because of industrialization, of which this project played a part, a lot of handmade textiles stopped being made, and different methods of making them were lost over time. The techniques and the skills that are needed to create them died away as the work dried up. And as a result, there are certain categories of textile that were for a long time not being produced. And because they were also everyday textiles that were being worn by everyday people in large part, it's very rare for these pieces to survive in India itself. You don't have a lot of people who are holding on to trousers from 200 years ago unless they're really special trousers. So because he did this, we actually have some documentation of kinds of textiles that would otherwise be very, very hard to find examples of. And these things are now inspiring a new generation of textile designers and makers to rediscover old techniques, old styles, old types of textiles, and work towards recreating them, sometimes in new interpretations, sometimes as close as they could to the originals. But importantly, these albums are now being used as an inspiration for hand making, as opposed to an inspiration for industrial making. So I think Uthra is next. She's going to tell you all about that. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you all hear me? Okay, yes. And hello to everyone in the room. It's nice to be talking again to people in real life. So my name is Uthra Rajgopal. I'm an independent curator. I have a specialist interest in South Asian textiles. I used to work at the V&A and I used to work at the Whitworth, and I've been fortunate enough to work with the two largest collections of South Asian textiles held in the UK, which is in London and in Manchester. And I also work across South Asia and particularly in India. So what I'm going to talk to you about in my short presentation is how the Forbes Watson volumes have been used by contemporary artists in projects, in artworks, in exhibitions, how I've used them, how they've been displayed, etc. What I would say, first of all, is that thanks to the digitization project that was spearheaded by the Harris Museum in Preston, all 700 samples are available to view through the website, the Textile Manufacturers of India, and that's the slide you can see on your screen now. So if anyone is interested in learning more about the volumes and the samples, it's a brilliant resource. Avalon and I are constantly singing its praises. So if you can't get into an institution where the volumes are held, please do access this online. And the photography is very crisp and very clear, and you can zoom in and really see some wonderful details about the fabric. So highly recommend that. And I should also say, as a curator, and Avalon and Megan will also support what I'm about to say, is that these collections are available for everyone to view and everyone to access. They belong to all of us. So it's not just that they're held in museums for the museum staff to look at. So if you want to look at the collection in real life, come to Huddersfield, go to the V&A, go to the Whitworth, the Harris, etc. So please do access them and enjoy looking at them. So I'm going to start off by talking about the last exhibition I curated with the Crafts Council in London, and it focused on cotton and the sort of the darker histories of cotton in the context of empire and in the context of those transnational trading routes that still take place today. And this exhibition, for those of you who know about it and who were able to see it, was born out of the British Textile Biennial 2021 and also the Art in Manufacturing Festival that brought together these artists. And the artists that were pulled together for this show were Bartley Palmer, Ritu Sattar, Bridget McClear and Raisa Kabir. And I'm going to talk in particular about two artists in that exhibition, Raisa Kabir and Ritu Sattar, who were directly inspired by the Forbes Watson collection, and in particular the samples relating to cotton and muslin coming out of Dhaka. So in this particular slide, what you can see is a view of the exhibition. On the far left, you can see a loom that actually is a working loom that belongs to Raisa Kabir, and in the foreground, this duck egg blue textile hanging is an artwork that Raisa Kabir made in conjunction with John Spencer Mill Textiles during her residency with the festival, National Festival of Making, Art and Manufacturing. And the script on it relates to all the workers and the people who were part of the whole machinery, if you like, of putting together textiles and manufacturing them today. And in the background, you can see a hand-woven piece that she's made that I'll tell you more about in a minute, and a film that I will also play to you in brief, which shows Raisa going through the samples of the Forbes Watson collection. So, like I said, we've got these two artworks that Raisa had made. On the left, you can see the names of different jobs that people have at John Spencer Textiles: weaver, warper, labourer, even job titles like marketing, administrator, because it's all these people who are responsible for bringing together the textile and giving it its life in terms of its production, but also in terms of its marketing and trade and beyond the mill, so to speak. And on the right hand side is this beautiful, very colourful hand woven piece that is actually made up of a series of very complex patterns. Now, to the eye, you would come across this and you'd think, oh, it's a beautiful, colourful, very ornate, intricately woven textile, and it is. But when you look into it, what this artist has actually done is that she has taken the Bangla script, the national language of Bangladesh, and looked at certain letters and then has mapped that onto graph paper and then started to break it down or code it so that there are sections and fragments of letters from that script that have then been implemented into this very ornate pattern. And the reason why she had broken it down into fragments of script is to represent the political and social upheaval of the Indian subcontinent. So during the time of empire, you can see in this tapestry hoop, there's an embroidery sketch of the subcontinent landmass. And at that time, Pakistan, parts of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, parts of Myanmar, they were all part of the Indian Empire, which was part of the British colonies. And so she looked at that history and the fragmentation of that land and took these letters and script and pulled that together, dismantled it, and then put it back together in this very intricate woven piece. And here is a detail of a detailed close-up of the actual textile. Those people who can read Bengali can actually make out certain letters or words in the script, and it was a beautiful moment when I actually went into the exhibition with a colleague of mine who was a Bengali speaker, reader and writer, and she was actually standing in front of the piece and she was reading things from the actual textile. So I'm just going to show you a little piece of film that was in the cotton exhibition.
The works that I've been using and weaving create a text language that reference many different communities that are present in Lancashire today. Of these four, primarily I've been working with Punjab, Lahore, Dhaka, Sylhet and Calcutta. These are diasporas of many people who have travelled and migrated to live in East Lancashire and West Yorkshire and many different parts of the UK. The reason why I've been using these textile archives as a starting point for the work is because the works that are present in the Harris Museum and Art Gallery contain the names of these places, and I often think that the names of these places don't really get shown as part of archives that are present in the UK. So a little bit about the history of the books. So they're called the Textile Manufacturers of India. They were used as a kind of like business catalogue. They were created by this guy called John Forbes Watson. So sometimes the books are called the John Forbes Watson books or JFW. And he created them in 1866 when he was the director of the India Museum. So this was a kind of a name for a collection of items that have been brought over from India. When we say India, it's comprised of colonial occupation of South Asia by the British at this point.
If you want to see the rest of that film, it is available online on Raisa Kabir's website. Her website is not called raisakabir.com. It's called Lids Sewn Shut. So that's what you need to put in your Google search. But I presume if you put Raisa Kabir in Google, it would also come up. And what that film went on to show was Raisa looking through examples of muslin, different types of woven cotton, different types of woven textiles from places like Sylhet and Dhaka and Calcutta. And it was also about, as she explained in that film, raising awareness and making more apparent those connections with different parts of the South Asian diasporic communities in the UK and in other parts of the world, because the average person, certainly from a South Asian background growing up in this country, would not necessarily have been aware that there would have been archives of textile samples from Madras, from Sylhet, from Dhaka, sitting in these hallowed museum institutions. So a lot of our work is also involves raising awareness and making those connections more transparent to people from different communities, particularly in the South Asian community. Just pop it on that one. No, yeah. So the other artist I'm going to talk to you about, how am I doing for time? Okay, I'll speed up. Ritu Sattar was very interested in the political history of the trade in muslin and looked into the history of the East India Company and Dhaka, and specifically looked at these samples and put together a really beautiful film, which has just been shown at an international film festival in the Netherlands. I don't think I'm going to have time to play it, but if you go online and you Google Shabnam, you should be able to watch a trailer of it. This is just a screenshot of one of the slides, right? I put the link on there to the trailer. And interestingly, Shabnam means morning dew. And in one of the books accompanying the textile manufacturers of India, it goes through the different categories and qualities of muslin from Bengal, from Dhaka, and Shabnam is written and described as and sort of it's listed there as one of the descriptors for the fineness of muslin, and there are lots of other descriptors that are listed there. So it's very interesting to trace that history and see that being categorized and listed. And it also tells us how astute and how aware Forbes Watson was of the different qualities of muslin that was being produced in Dhaka, in Bengal at the time. And like Avalon has mentioned, the great irony is that these archives are now one of the few places where you can actually access these very fine quality muslins. And so weavers and people who are looking to revive this industry will come back to these Forbes Watson volumes to access these samples, to understand the complexities of the weave and the design and the intricacies. But this particular film, Shabnam, talks about the physicality, the labor, the exhaustion that took place in the production of the muslin, and also it's beautifully interwoven with the politics and the history that the East India Company imposed on that particular land. When I was at the Whitworth, frequently used the Forbes Watson collection, not only in study sessions, but also when I was putting together an exhibition on South Asian textiles, which was called Beyond Borders. And that brought together a group of artists from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Rice Kabir was also in that exhibition. One of the artists that I worked with, they were actually an artist duo called Kona. This is a very bad slide, I apologize, but it gives you an overview of part of the exhibition. But if you look very, very carefully, there and there are volumes of the Forbes Watson books, and they were deliberately chosen to speak to the histories of the Weavers Service Centre that had developed in post-independent India, and the types of designs that were coming out in terms of weave, print, and embroidered designs. And then Jamdani and muslin was also a big part of the Beyond Borders exhibition, and so these are works by Yash, who also looked at the history and the politics in the trade of muslin. And she came to Manchester and did a performance artwork. And this is actually called A Tailor is Sewing a Dress for Tipu Sultan. And she brought with her hand-woven Jamdani muslin, which she then cut and sewed into this beautiful dress that was displayed on a mannequin. And the histories of the fragmentation of the Indian Empire, the subcontinent, is still very much spoken about in contemporary art pieces today. And the idea of those populations and communities being fragmented connects so vividly with the way in which the materials and the fabrics have been cut and collated into these samples. And so when artists go back to access these Forbes Watson collections, they're looking at how these samples have been cut, how they have been dislocated from the actual communities that they belong to, notwithstanding the fact that Forbes Watson did categorize them quite meticulously in terms of how they were worn and what they were used for. But at the end of the day, he was categorizing them in such a way so that they could be manufactured in the UK and sold back to the populations of the subcontinent. And so he did, I think, look at it with rose-tinted spectacles, in that, oh, we can, the idea that people in India would somehow have a better life. I mean, it was just such a sort of one-sided view and a very much a rose-tinted spectacle view of what he thought life was going to be like, when it, in fact, the influx of foreign goods and foreign cloth caused extreme poverty and hardship, which spearheaded the movement championed by Gandhi of Swadeshi and Swaraj. So it's a very interesting collection that's still very much in use, and please do go and look at it. It's there to be studied, admired, but also to unpack these very entangled histories and to understand just how complex the textile industry was during the colonial period. So yes, that's my talk, and thank you very much for listening.